Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Brian Murphy on foreign-backed disinformation and its impact on the homeland. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Inside Intelligence. We're really happy to have Brian Murphy with us today to talk about foreign-backed disinformation and its impact on our homeland. Brian is the Managing Director for Logically.ai. Before joining Logically, he served as both the Principal and Acting Secretary for Intelligence for DHS. He was a special agent with the FBI for 20 years and served as a national manager in various capacities, including in Afghanistan, Algeria, Tunisia, and Washington, D.C. He also began his foreign federal service in 1994 in the Marine Corps and would later return to that role in 2004 when he was called up for active service in Iraq. Since 2021, he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program, where he teaches Homeland Security. He's also a member of the DHS's Election Infrastructure Committee. And in 2024, he became president of the Information Professionals.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you here. And if you want to go ahead and start with your presentation, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So if you don't mind, Peter, just confirming that you can see what I've put up. You can see my slides?
Yes, I can.
All right. Let me start at the beginning here. So, hey, thanks again, Peter. And what I'm going to talk about today, as you saw the title, I'm going to break it down a bit. We're going to be looking at cognitive influence or cognitive operations or warfare, however you want to call it, within the homeland. So from an intelligence perspective, as a professional, it can be very challenging whether you're in kind of looking abroad or your kind of remit is in the U.S., because this presents a unique and different challenge to the intelligence professionals that are joining us today. So when I'm going to be talking today, I'll be talking about disinformation. I'm going to break that down. Disinformation is a weapon of war in the cognitive influence operation space. And I'll give some definitional structure to it in a minute, because it can be a very politically challenging and toxic word. And there's a lot of definitions for it out there. Not saying any of them are right or wrong, but I'll give you mine. So when I'm using the term, it'll be clear to what it is. But at the essence, when we think about cognitive influence operation and disinformation as a weapon to kind of carry that out, we're living in an area where, as you see on this first slide, it can be used in a number of different areas, right? Armed conflict, in the gray zone, during peace with rivals, and for domestic control of an audience, right? And really what disinformation is about as an avenue to gain an advantage is power. So when we're talking about disinformation, again, I'm putting into that national security context as it lives within that kind of horizon. So as I'm using the word disinformation, and I would say and challenge everybody listening today to come up with better definitions, because I don't think mine is totally complete, but it's the best one I can come up with right now. I think there needs to be 3 criteria in place for a piece of content to be considered disinformation. The first is, as you can see on the slide there, the originator of the information is intentionally masking who they are, right? And that's a key element, which I'm going to go back to in a minute. The second is the information that's released has got a purpose behind it. And generally it's destructive. Sometimes it can be constructive, but generally the people releasing the information are trying to do something against an adversary population. And third, those releasing the information have a predetermined political, military, economic, or social objective by releasing that information. All three of these things, when I'm using the word disinformation, need to be in place before a piece of content can be considered, in my viewpoint, disinformation from an intelligence perspective. And the reason I bring that up is the term has got a lot of connotations to it, a lot of political leanings to it, and it gets thrown about quite a bit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be used in a lot of different ways. What I'm not talking about when we speak about disinformation, cognitive warfare, is a political speech, lies, hate speech. I'll talk a bit more about malinformation and propaganda. I'm going to kind of push those to the side, not out of convenience, but simply because they don't fall into, for the most part, the definitions that I put out there. So to kind of break that down further, if you pick your presidential candidate, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, presuming they'll be the two nominees, or an adversary state leader such as Putin, when they're speaking, they could be in the factually lying, they could be telling the truth. However you want to view that as a receiver of the information. But what distinguishes them from this paradigm I have here is we know their identity, right? You clearly know who they are. So you can interpret that information based on your own experience. You can do research on it, all these different types of things. When someone is covertly sending out a message, it becomes much more difficult for the receiver to kind of get that same baseline understanding. So I talked a bit about from the perspective of things that can make this a more political term, and why it's been very hard for intelligence professionals to really be as effective as they probably want to be in this space. So if we think about the term malinformation, it's been adopted by many in the executive branch. If you've heard of MDM, which is mis, dis, or malinformation, malinformation is not necessarily a legal term. There are some areas where it is used, but it's a pretty squishy term, right? And it leaves open to interpretation because it's not very well defined. It leads to this kind of circle I have here, or feeding into each other, where increased polarization, right? People hear malinformation, and that's very much can be interpreted very much in the eye of the beholder. What is malinformation? It's hard to pin that down, right? So when intelligence professionals are doing their work, they can stumble through these definitions because there's not a great framework by fully identifying what it is. And when it's revealed, that sometimes can be charged in terms of the politics of it, from how the media may receive it, rightly or wrongly, or the lay public as well. So why is cognitive influence operations a really sticky thing to kind of go after in the domestic landscape? So this term, RCSMO, stands for Russian Covert Social Media Operations. And I use it as an example because it shows us that Gordian knot that's really in place out there, right? So when an adversary such as Russia, in today's world and in the last couple of years, have the capability now to reach into the United States and help try to drive opinions, foment unrest, cause polarization, whatever their end state is, using covert proxies and other ways to kind of amplify their message, right? But what makes it really challenging is the minute that they project themselves into the United States, they will start intersecting with freedom of speech, protected speech, because a lot of times what they're saying is not new content, it's content that is already existing in the public domain. And what our adversary, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, etc., or violent extremist organizations, they will go after all those hot button polarization issues where they know it's challenging for the executive branch and intelligence professionals to identify the foreign actors in there, because it touches on these hot button issues, whether it's race relations, sexual identity, gun rights, you pick your candidate coming up, the border, whatever it is. These are the issues by which our adversaries kind of go after us and make it really, really challenging for the professionals in the domestic and the international space to kind of understand the intelligence and then do something about it. What do they do with this intelligence, right? How do they shape policy? How do they formulate responses, or how they help policymakers formulate responses? So despite its many challenges, and I'm just kind of giving you the top level version of it, I do think there are answers out there that can be had. As a country, we spend a lot of money and time, and this is a good thing, about helping our allies do something in this space, right? And but we at home, when we speak about the domestic space, we do very little. It's not that we don't do anything, but we do very little because of these tough political challenges that I represented before. But I do want to make sure that I leave all of you with some ideas and thoughts that I have, so you can iterate off them, challenge them, make them better. Obviously, if you don't like them, I always like to hear that as well. But in a government response, if we kind of go way back, what is it the government's trying to do at the executive branch level within the homeland? Really, what the goal should be is making sure the free marketplace of idea is free for Americans to have different ideas and a range of thoughts. But when we think back about the disinformation avenue as a weapon of war, we don't live in a society where we have that free marketplace of ideas. We have some level of saturation covertly by our adversaries that are trying to shape and form our thoughts and stoke polarization and divide us as a country for their various objectives that are out there, right? And all in one breath, what we have been doing from both the congressional and the executive side is looking at the social media companies as the answer, that it is their responsibility to do something about nation-state activity. And then we also, some of us will blame them for not doing enough, right? So when we think about the elections, these are cost centers for those that work in business, to trust and safety teams that, whether it's Meta or somebody else, has to put together to kind of deal with elections or whatever whether it's an adversary nation or just a threat within the US to deal with, it costs them money. So when we go back to the executive branch's responsibilities, what I've argued is we've looked at the kind of social media companies as all these things, the answers, the villains, et cetera. And I think the executive government has abdicated the responsibility because it is an executive government responsibility, not saying that the social media companies don't have a share of it, but in the end, you pay your tax dollars so that the things like the free marketplace of ideas remain free, and we can have that independent debate. So in deciding what to do about it, we need to go back to the social contract that we've all signed up for, that where is that line between where is government overreach, where they've gone too far, where do we want to give some of our liberties up with the right checks and balances in place, so that the government or other areas can do something their end to do something about the threat problem. So you have like 3 areas that I would go through. What is the threat level? What does it mean? What is the ethical responsibility that the government has? And what's a proportional response to make sure that we keep that legitimacy in place? Where do we not go too far? And the last thing I'll wrap up with is in this problem set for the intelligence professionals, I think you play a major role in identifying these foreign lines of operation, but a different construct is probably needed, where this is not so much government-led, but government has a role in identifying what an adversary campaigns are, and then enabling others in civil society to be the voice and coming up with solutions. Because the solutions aren't the digital Afghanistan of whack-moling every Russian trotter bolt or bot or troll, sorry, or identifying their narratives at speed and scale. What it is building long-term cognitive-related solutions that begin in the educational space and federate across civil society so that we become better social media literacy attuned citizens, and we develop that media literacy to be more responsible about what we're seeing and hearing so that we can do something about this threat. So that is, Michael, a bit about how I think about the problem in the domestic space.
Thanks very much, Brian. Sorry about, by the way, my internet connection having gone. The Russians at it again, so I can't do much. We'll see if I stay on how long. But one question I have to start out with, Brian, is early on in your definition I think something that may have surprised some of our listeners today is that you identify the information as harmful or destructive, but you don't highlight it as being false. Can you explain that? I think a lot of definitions of disinformation is that it's false, correct?
I think, yeah, I think that's probably why at some level the term is also very political. To me, it does not need to be false information. Many times it's true information. And I talked about some of those political cleavages or societal cleavages that adversaries will go after, such as abortion. I've mentioned sexual identity, gun rights. I mean, what they're saying about those issues is generally not false. Instead, they're trying to amplify those issues so that we see each other within the United States as the other, with the end state not just being polarization to be the end state, but to make Americans look at their country as something not at the base level, not worth fighting for. Because this is a weapon that the adversary is trying to undermine the United States. So in the ultimate situation, which is open, full conflict, U.S. citizens don't want to fight for their country, or the Taiwanese don't want to defend their country in advance of a Chinese invasion or something along those lines. So yeah, I agree with you, Michael.
Let's talk a little bit about origins, and I know you discussed this in your book. And there's some about where the Russians started to see this, and you, I think, if I may have this correct, a lot of what we're seeing globally is really of Russian origin. Is that correct? I mean, they seem to be still the major player in this type of strategy. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is, but there are near peer competitors, particularly China and Iran, are quickly moving into the act, because our responses to date have been, whether they're sanctions or whatever they are, deemed by adversaries to be low consequence, and they believe the return is high in investment. So the Chinese are very quickly moving that space. And I'm not here to talk about my company, but you'll see coming out either today or the next day, we found some great examples very recently of the Chinese actively involved in Spanish-speaking American discussions in the political context, right? And this is not new, but we are more and more identifying other adversaries taking up that space as well, because it's cheap and effective and the consequences are low, and they know we're not really doing tons about it at the executive branch level.
Do we see, so go back to the Russian question a little bit. They saw this as a way to restore the balance, didn't they, in the strategic asymmetrical relationship with the U.S. And they theorized about how they could use this. We didn't really, and it seems like we didn't really pick up on how much they were putting into this, maybe, until 2016. Do you think that we've learned much from them about their capabilities and how much impact it's had? We've had 8 years to be sort of thinking of this over.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good news story. We're not where we were in pre-2016. We're in a much better position. I still think there's a long way to go, and on the solution side, we're not all the way there. But no, we're in a better shape. There are a lot of people on this line that are interested in this topic, that are writing about it, trying to come up with solutions and outlining the adversary. So I think we're worlds apart where we were pre-2016.
Right. One of the things that struck me, and I'll be interested in your opinion on it, is the intelligence community assessment that was declassified about the 2022 election and the amount of disinformation campaigns detected on that. And at least, yeah, I mean, I'll let you talk. My impression was interesting was it didn't lead with the Russians, first of all, which I found to be very interesting. And also, I think it, like what you were saying, it emphasized that really they're focusing on amplifying messages that are already out there.
Yeah, I think so sequentially you have the ICA from 2020 that comes out, and then the 2022. And also associated with that are some great reports that I recommend people interested in this topic take a look at. So there's a ODNI report about 2040 and what that world will look like. These things are all very similar. And what it talks about is information, and it really, I think, at the essence of 2022. I mean, it is the oil of today. It is the salt of the British Navy. These things are the commodity of information is kind of where it's at, and adversary nations very much understand that, and that's why they're all getting into the game, and them realizing they don't need to do something creative in the sense of coming up with new content. There's plenty of information that they can play on in the space. And they also know that that challenges us as a free society to do something about it.
Let's talk a little bit about government capacity that's developed. And there's been some new initiatives, maybe not sufficient, but at least we have CISA and DHS. We have the Farm Line Influence Center. Perhaps you can speak to those things briefly and some other initiatives.
Yeah, I think there's, these things did not exist in the way they do now, pre-2016. So one, they're a sign of that there's progress underway. But I do think the executive branch professionals would probably seek to do more, but there's huge political issues out there. And so in their way, if you would, is the political backing. And that has nothing to do with any one administration. This is a not timeless, but this is a long-term proposition across multiple administrations going back. And I think the ones in the future are also going to be challenged, because there's great collection going on, but what do you do with that information? And the so what factor, I think, is challenging. The Malign Foreign Influence Center, the center at the ODNIs had a tough start, and it's not their fault. The people there are doing great work, but there's a political process associated with intelligence collection, and same with CISA and what they're trying to do. So I think they're a bit stuck right now. So I think there's a willingness there, there's a desire there, but the game plan and the solutions and to get through the political swamp is not keeping a pace with that. So from output side, what the meaning is of what they're doing, I think is challenged, right? How effective are they? I think they can be more effective, but how effective will the political system allow them to be?
My last question, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat and the Q&A. And folks, please ask your questions in either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get right to them. Last thing, Brian, I mean, as you know, you've had a diverse career in FBI and DHS, and you understand the intelligence analysis. How is this impacting that? Where we are putting so much emphasis now on social media and open source intelligence, is in fact, and some people say, as the int of first resort. Yet here we have foreign adversaries working overtime to corrupt that environment. And how is intelligence analysts supposed to cope with that?
Well, I think the intel world is shifting in the right direction, and some it's a big cycle, right? So if you look at Dulles, who isn't just the guy who is named after an airport here in the DC area, but when Dulles came to be eventually running the CIA, one of the first things he talked about in front of Congress is that OSINT is probably one of our greatest strengths, right? I can't remember his exact words, but about 80% of the intelligence you can find in the open source. I do think that's challenged a bit, where OSINT is still an extremely not popular, but really important asset, but discerning where we get the provenance of the information is becoming harder and harder. So I do think OSINT as a professional int needs to get better exploration to it. I think the government is kind of moving in that direction, but there are also challenges with that. And so when we talk about technology, I'm not worried about deepfakes. A lot of people talk about that, but there's great technology to find deepfakes. I do think where we have more challenges is the speed and scale by which adversaries can sound more like Americans, using Chat GPT and other things to augment their cultural understanding and the way to use language. And then that challenges the intel community to better discern. It just adds a layer to the provenance of the information. And there's other techniques to obfuscate, as everyone knows here, where information comes from, right? And so these are going to be continual challenges in the open source field, which is why we need to have good old SIGINT from a classified perspective combined. We need all our ints together to operate collectively, to have a good viewpoint on what the adversary is trying to do.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions. Scott asks, are there technologies to reliably identify, evaluate, and inform the public of weaponized disinformation so that people are aware and can make their own decisions on how to deal with it?
I think there's many of them. A lot of the industry that looks at this will look at narratives, so not necessarily the individual artifact or the person tweeting out something, but across languages, across gray site media, social media, wherever it is. What is that narrative, and can you track it back from a signaling perspective to a foreign adversary? And there are some great work, great technology where, just for simplicity, let's say there's a Russian position on the Ukraine war, you'll find that federate out and appear in multiple systems and newspapers and social media, all roughly talking about the same thing. So you can use signaling to find out, as an example, this happens almost simultaneously across the world in multiple languages. Could be a coincidence, but likely it's probably a foreign campaign. So there's great technology out there. I think the challenge is not the technology, but getting the credible voices together to kind of explain this at speed and scale as well to the American public. And that is still lacking. There is not a center of gravity in the United States that is in charge of all this, right? And I don't think it can be the government. I think it has to be a hybrid approach where the government's feeding the understanding of what's happening. These technology companies are finding it, and the voices, they need to be a collective, whether from the right, left, middle, center, out there. They all need to be involved in explaining what the technology is finding.
That probably is a good segue into the next question, because Sheila's asking, I mean, how closely can the government work with social media companies on this? So we know there seems to be more of a dialogue or effort at moral suasion, but other than that, I mean, how much how far can you get with this?
Well, so hindsight's 2020, and so when the Twitter files came out, whether you believe in what's said about them from a negative or positive perspective, you want to look at it, the reality is some people in the United States look at that close relationship in a very negative way. Okay, and there was probably mistakes the government made, and some of it's probably wrong reporting or right reporting, or however you want to look at it. I do think there's a huge place for the government to play a role, but we are fighting yesterday's war in this space with the wrong mindset. To be successful, it's not a matter of working with the social media companies. It is the radical transparency and a hybrid approach which needs to come to play, right? So it's not enough just to have the government with the social media companies working together, because the social media companies are business. They have their own interests. And that's not a bad thing. That's what a business does. And so your level of trust to them, is going to be different by how you look at them. Getting other groups into that discussion and radical transparency is really important. Where are your watchdog groups? Where are your NGOs? Where are your critics, right? So that it's not just two groups operating in a cone of silence. And that's usually how the executive branch operates, and there's good reasons for that, sources and methods. But in this case, that is not the solution. And what we fund in many locations around the world is that hybrid approach where transparency is a major component of it. So I don't look at it as what is the role. I think there is a role, but how is that role augmented with other actors involved in the process?
Here's a question on what, say, the Russians are doing in terms of tactics and operating with their compatriots in the U.S., legitimate Russian-speaking groups in the U.S. Is there something that we are concerned about? Is this something we should be countering, or is this really off limits?
Well, I think we should be concerned about it. I think there's a lot of good research going on. Does cognitive influence operations as projected by an adversary state in the United States, doesn't matter. So a lot of the kind of binary discussion will go back to, well, look at 2016 where any votes changed. And there's conflicting, scientific studies on that. And I think we all have our own kind of thoughts on that. And I don't know what the right answer is because I don't know if we have the baseline. But if you look at in today's world, eight years later and moving, I do think the information is out there, and in most minds, in many, the jury is in, although there's still some and should be debate on that it has some level of influence within the United States, right? Polarization is out there. Did the Russians start it? No. We have a truth deficit, if filter bubbles, algorithms, all these things, but they're a part of the problem. And they're not making it easier for Americans to understand each other. And there is some level of influence they have. What that is, if you look at the one of the slides they had up before, is we still need to measure exactly what their influence is. But the only way to do that is to kind of further identify that problem, that the American public can look at it, scientists can get their hands on the results, and keep doing peer-reviewed research on that to kind of fully answer that question. But I mean, my personal position is, yes, it does matter. I think there's influence. Is it an existential threat to the United States? I used to say yes. I'm not so sure I think that anymore. But I don't think we're doing enough to, one, know it and do something about it.
You don't think it's existential because why?
I did for a period of time, maybe when I was writing my book, because I was living in my own book, look at it as an existential threat. America's built, there's a tradition here, and that's not going to change overnight. And the tradition comes from a lot of different viewpoints. We're having these discussions, right? We're just our own country. And I mean that in a unique and good way. I do think disinformation from a perspective of the Russians or someone else trying to do something about it, they've been after us for a while, and they've had various degrees of success. I think we in the U.S. Can do things about it and will do things about it, and that we're not going to sit static, and we haven't sat static. So I think there is good green shoots happening across the intelligence community and in the private sector and the NGO world to do something about it. That's why I don't think it is an existential threat, because I think we are starting to make strides in that area.
I'd like to address something. One of our listeners has raised the question of disinformation playing into certain biases. Is this, and that's true. But is there anything you really can do about this in a sense? There's a school of thought that we should be trying to raise people's critical thinking standards on how to deal with things like this. I think others feel like this is just the way people express their identity. Is that they see something that, oh, I agree with that. I see that. I like that, How much is there, do you think, room for education to help fight back against these disinformation campaigns?
I think there's a lot of room, but from a narrow viewpoint. And what I believe education's job is to allow people to know that the people propagating ideas they may or may not agree with are coming from the Russians, the Chinese, or the Iranians. They may agree with the sentiment, but they should know the provenance of it, right? The challenge is that this becomes political, because Donald Trump is the easier case to talk about. People will say, Donald Trump, and you can believe it or not, I'm not trying to argue either way. The Russians were supporting him to be the president of the United States in 2016. That's likely true. And politically, that makes a great story. And you could love or hate Donald Trump. But the Russians' objective, I think, as we look back, it wasn't so much to elect Donald Trump, but rather because he would be viewed in a way and would polarize the country, and it was good for them politically because it distracted us in our foreign policy and caused problems, whether you like Trump or not, in the country. That is their objective. So what can education do about it? A lot. We have the ability to say, look, this is what the Russians are trying to achieve. It is not about that political issue. When you take a step back, the bigger picture from a Russian perspective is stoking polarization. So when it comes to the Ukraine war, we can't have a reasonable debate about it. When it comes to whatever it is that is their foreign policy objectives, it's hard for the US to have that objective because one side will say, see, the Russians are supporting this idea. So building resiliency in and understanding where the provenance is really, I think, the first step to build good, discerning citizens. And then they can agree or disagree with the subject of it, whether the Russians are behind it and agree with it or not.
Yeah, I mean, another person asked a similar question that, what about it? Building up information literacy in the country, just where we're getting our information from and how credible a source is this?
Precisely.
Yeah. And when you mentioned earlier something about the deep fakes, right? And and I wanted to ask about this myself. I'm not sure, maybe there's a question in the chat about it, but there's obviously a lot of news on this right now, and but it doesn't strike me we've seen the type of a kind of the Stuxnet version of deep fake, if you will. Where something that really has a major impact. We've seen things at kind of a sort of a retail level where maybe they fooled some people in criminal activity. What's your thoughts on this? Is this something that is going to just becoming a growing problem, or is this something that we can functionally manage?
I think it is something we can functionally manage. And I actually look at, there's a lot of resiliency built from when deep fakes are identified, because they are easier to identify. I'm not saying that all of them are, and it will get more challenging. But when the speaker comes out and says, look, that just wasn't me, right? Like, usually there's other things beyond the image that can corroborate what the speaker's saying. And I think it's a resiliency building exercise. I think it's actually helped to get better discerning viewers out there, whether it's something you're seeing non-political on social media or it is political, because the news or companies will identify it often as a deep fake. And it makes, those are types of things I think are, even though it's not the intentionality of the adversary, it makes us better discerners. It's just that we don't put that together in a way to say this is social media or media literacy. It's more just kind of lives by itself. So I'm not worried about deep fakes. I think there's other things out there in the cognitive influence operations that are much more concerning to me. We're not doing enough work, but there's great tech out there that finds these things. Now that may change. That can, and it may change in the future.
Paul, I'm going to try to modify your question a little bit. I mean, and something that Brian brought up earlier about, essentially you're masking under his definition, disinformation. The author is masked, right? This is really clandestine in a sense. And so how can the media companies, for example, the social media companies, would it improve things if they insisted that this was a real account that to register? I mean, like Facebook does. Is that something that would at least help to staunch the flow of this?
I think it's part of a solution, but there's no one thing by itself that's going to be useful, and they all have goods and bads, right? There is some, the Supreme Court has ruled, and I believe in it, anonymity is not a bad thing in the United States. There's a place for it, right? Mm-hmm. And there's an important place of anonymity. Bots, trolls, those types of things, they have a commercial value, whether we like them or not. And so, I'm not so sure that's by itself the answer, or there's one thing. That said, I do think when you build literacy campaigns, having people fully aware of, I love to go hunting, and every time I open up, my laptop, I'm getting flooded with we're coming in turkey season. I got it. I know that it's coming. So there's some good things by there. I catch some sales, but there's also things I don't like, right? The answer is I need to know why that's happening, right? It's not just because I like hunting. It's because it's coming to me for a reason. And so if you take that weak analogy, and roll it into the cognitive warfare space. I think identifying accounts that are true has its place, but it can't be done in isolation because the adversary gets a vote. I think we spend too much time on social media, and yeah, they're still involved there, but they're moving off that. They're getting clever and they're moving into other areas. So that's why I think it's got its place. But the long-term media resiliency, civics, those types of things are much more part of the answer than these tactical things, which can have a place for a moment, but aren't going to really over time have the impact that I think we probably want it to.
One of our listeners asked about the fusion center model. Is this something that might be able to work on the disinformation side, like we've seen for where we put in place on counterterrorism in this country?
I still think, in government, one thing you'll hear is like, oh, we need a new center. And then anybody involved in inter-policy discussions will run away from that. And so will the taxpayer. Because what do these centers often lead to? And sometimes it's nothing. But in this case, I don't think we have the right construct in place. So I wouldn't think, to me, the Fusion Center is the right construct for it. One, they're generally, as far as I know them, and I've been to many fusion centers and across the country, from a federal perspective, they're government-run organizations. And with that comes limitations and politics. Not that the Fusion Center people are involved in politics, but you will have a governor who will appoint whoever to be in charge of whether it's public services and it instantly takes on a political consultation, not instantly, many times. So I don't think that they're the right home. That concept is the right home. But a better way I would think about it is if you know what, and there are multiple ones we have in the US, is the National Missing and Exploited Children's Center, NMIC, is not run by the government. It is there and run by the private sector to protect the rights of the victims first. But there's heavy infusion of government, right? But they're in charge. So there are different constructs like that. And I think we need one that does not have government in the lead. So I wouldn't advocate for as I understand the Fusion Center construct as it exists today, but instead to build that fusion model with different people in charge.
Okay, some more questions, some little more pointed questions here. One is about CISA's responsibility. What does it stand for? What does it do?
So that's a great question. So if you look at 2016, right around that time, the government decides that elections writ large will be a part of the critical infrastructure of which CISA will have, from a federal perspective, the coordinating impact to it, right? Elections are still run in by states, but they'll have a coordination role to it. I think they've tried to find their place, and they've run into those, not by any, I couldn't have done any better. And if you know my background, I haven't done any better. So I'll put myself in that same position. But what I would say is they've run into the rocks of politics recently, and it's kind of beached their efforts because they don't have the right construct in place. Should they play a role? Yes. It should be a backseat role. There's great work that can be done through DHS, for example, through grant funding to help stand up a different type of center where the government plays a role, but isn't in charge. And there are also cyber perspectives. If you CIS, Center for Internet Security, is a good example of that, right? It's run by the private sector, where you have a lot of government relationships to it. So I think they can play a strong role. I don't think they found the footing in a way, and it's not the current CISA. I think it's CISA and everybody else. They're still trying to find that right approach. I don't think they found the right combination yet.
A couple of people have been asking about how AI can help on our detection of disinformation. Can we speak to that about this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I work in an AI company. I'm not a data scientist, but I certainly spent a lot of time working on the problem sets. I think AI kind of took, not people necessarily on this call, but a lot of people by storm when ChatGPT came out, but it's not a new concept. And it's a tool like anything else. It's been great in terms of rapid advancements, and it brings a lot of benefits to it. But like every other tool, it has its other side to it, and people always use tools, unfortunately, for the negative, right? So I think we're just getting our arms around how to manage it. And there does need to be some more rigor put in place in terms of managing AI from a regulatory perspective. And I think we'll see some of that. But I don't look at AI as the answer or the graveyard to the cognitive influence space. I think it will have an impact, but it also helps identify adversary campaigns. We use it every day for that very reason. So I think it's just a tool, and we need to get our arms around it. We need to regulate it where it needs to be regulated, and just get smarter about what it actually is. I think it's a great step forward, but it comes with its costs too.
I'm going to ask a few questions of our listeners. Andy, could you be more specific when you say targeting on your question there? If you could ask that more specifically, and we'll see if we can get to it. There's other questions about, disinformation and government use. Is it always, well, you kind of define it as malign, but malign for who? So is there cases where the U.S. has used disinformation as part of a covert action, or as in war?
Yeah, I do think that it is. So this question comes up a lot, and that's a great question. So yeah, we as a country have certainly used disinformation in wars. So if you look at World War II, there are great examples. There's movies made about it, right? I think it very much depends on, and disinformation and cognitive warfare also can be a dirty word, and for good reason. I'm not discounting that in the United States, and like, well, is this the right moral and ethical thing for the US government to do, right? And that can be a debate to be had, but do we use it? Yes. I think it is important to understand who is emanating the information, because we are not China, we are not Iran, and we are not Russia, right? We're not an authoritarian state that is killing our dissidents in jail, like just happened in Russia recently, a few days ago. We're not sending our populace away for re-education like they do in China. And I'm not saying the U.S. is perfect. We've got our own history, but we are a country that does try to get it right. So do we use it? Yes. Can it be used for good like any other weapon of war? Yeah. Can it be used for bad? Absolutely. It depends on the use case. I think it's a very powerful tool that we've used in the past, and there's probably use cases in the future that it will make sense with the right governance in place. And like any other weapon we use, very responsibly and target in a way to bring about results that meet, for example, our objectives that are in line with our policy and ethics. Yeah.
Thanks everybody for the great questions and dialogue in the chat and the Q&A today. If in some cases I may not have asked them because I thought we either covered it, or I think we need it. Maybe it wasn't quite on the topic, but if you want to ask a question, please go ahead. We have a few more minutes. One thing I want to ask you, Brian, and this is more of a strategic question, and it's something you grasp this a bit when you look at the IC assessment on the 2022 election, and you think of Russia's disinformation campaign, especially related to Ukraine and Eastern Europe and things. And I wonder, is there sort of a law of diminishing returns at work here? They're sort of exposed in using this. Some countries like that we are starting to consider malign actors almost habitually. How far have they gotten with this? In other words, have they really undermined the position of countries in Eastern Europe, or in fact, has it had the opposite effect? Did it really undermine the Ukrainian war effort, or did it have the opposite effect? And maybe one could even say about this country too. Did it have the opposite effect and rebounding against them on, in terms of our own foreign policy toward Russia? So, is there something of an issue with countries that habitually do this, that they're sort of alienating themselves on the world stage?
I think, yeah, like any weapon, right? It can be used and they may achieve that tactical victory, but they'll lose the strategic end state. So Ukraine, I think, is a perfect example. And I give, I'm not playing politics, but I give this administration a lot of credit. They came out quickly and identified lines of operation the Russians were trying to sow worldwide when it dealt with Ukraine. And I think it hurt the Russians more. They overplayed their hands, and it did more for resiliency building across the world, and probably hurt their image, right? It made more countries want to check into this threat, particularly in Europe. So in that case, I think that it backfired on them, if you would. There are other examples that I think they still have great usage for it because things aren't happening, right? And so we look at the domestic landscape, we're not doing as much. We aren't necessarily messaging the way we did in Ukraine. The GEC was a great job, as an example, outlining foreign adversary campaigns operating across the world over, right? You don't really see that in the United States, and I'm not pinging them. It's not their remit, and maybe it shouldn't be, but we don't have a structure in place to do a similar thing. So I think these things are all situational dependent. But yeah, there can be definite cases, and depending on the reaction of the host nation and the time and situation, it can definitely backfire, and it did in the case, I believe, of Ukraine. And I think you're right. People got angry in the United States with the Russians. And one of the ways that you build resiliency is to know you've been lied to. And one of the reasons I put in my definition that there needs to be a covert originator to it isn't because people can lie when you know they are who they are, but that is also a way by which we can understand this as a weapon and then defeat the weapon. Because identifying people who are lying to you, not just on their messaging, but who they are, people don't like that. And I do think your point after 2016 is valid. Yeah, I think it's made a positive distinction in the US and helped us get better at some level at media resiliency.
Okay, a couple final questions here. Do you see, I recall from your book, you're saying, the Europeans have had a longer history with this than us. They've been involved, they've been exposed to this longer than we have, in a sense. What have we learned from them, and how do you see us working with our NATO partners on issues of disinformation?
Yeah, I think there's some great models out there that we have helped put in place with our tax dollars, and some they do on their own. But I think there's some great models, and the Baltics is the easiest one to point to because they have some of the more mature models out there. But they have those hybrid centers where you have government working with academia and the press, and there's checks and balances in place. So they've been at it longer. They've got solutions, and those solutions aren't identical. I don't think you can lift and shift any one of them to the US context because we have a different system. Our First Amendment is different than their versions of First Amendment. And these are important distinctions, but I do think they are great models that we need to draw from. And there's some baseline takeaways. I didn't come up with the hybrid concept that I've been articulating. I'm basically copying what we are funding into other countries. And then I do think we need to Americanize it in a way that meets our protections, our civil liberties, it counts for our politics, and all of our past, good and bad, from a cultural standpoint as well.
Wanted to get to follow up from Andy. Andy was asking about, are we seeing or have we seen retaliation against US companies working with Ukraine and because of our policies? Do you have any sense of that?
Companies working,
like say maybe in the I would assume that in the disinformation area or anything or like that, would the Russians retaliate against American companies that are doing that?
That's a good question. I mean, the answer is yes. Usually it comes in a form of cyber or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. When we see them kind of launch counter campaigns against US companies, it's not to outline that company as against Ukraine, but they'll try to pivot it into a US conversation and say, no, we've got another one of these truth determining companies that when they talk about mis and disinformation, they're the arbiters of truth, right? So I think they've detected that as an important, already pre-existing political line, which has got its place in US discussion, and they'll try to turn that back around, to their benefit, which is not necessarily about Ukraine, but how do they leverage that? I think they recognize companies that work in the space and then see them as a way to kind of undermine what the US may be trying to be doing in response.
Finally, and I think this reflects a few questions that we've seen also in the chat. Where do we where do we balance this, and you mentioned this earlier in your presentation, with our tradition of free speech in this country, our very strong norm for and legal defense of this, and what the risks are. How, it sounds like you've changed some of your thinking over time, maybe. How do we balance this so we can, not sort of overreact to the problems of disinformation?
I think the first part is, it's easy to say, recognizing what the adversary's end state here is, right? And that is a discussion that people kind of understand, but it doesn't get enough airtime across government and in the media. And I'm not here to change the way media reports stories, but at the educational level, we're not really. It's hard to find that in kind of the discussion at the education level. So I think that the solutions, there's not one, but one of the most important ones is that long-term vision about building, I'll go back to it, social media resiliency, and it's not just understanding the provenance, but how algorithms work, right? There's a STEM component to this, which is really important. But we kind of live in the world in most school systems. Here's STEM, maybe you have civics. These two things don't really touch, and they are starting to touch conversations like this, and I think at the higher level of learning, but you don't really see them at the secondary and primary school educational levels. And that's there are some examples of it, certainly, but I think we need to get to that level to build long-term solutions, because the politics are going to come and go. Politics will always be politics, but getting to the point, a deeper level of understanding about what is happening is the kind of the way forward with it. I don't know if I answered that question. I drifted a bit off of it, but
Thanks. I mean, I think I think that's the best way you can answer it. And I'd like to thank you, Brian, for being with us today for this great talk about disinformation. Good luck in your work, and look forward to having you back. The next episode of Inside Intelligence will be March 27th, Peter, is that right? And it will be with Martin Gurry. He'll be talking about OSINT and his experience as an analyst on OSINT at CIA. So please join us on the March 27th for that, and look for the Eventbrite in your inbox. And for that, I'd like to again thank our great guest, Brian Murphy, and we'll see you next time.